everyone. Another installment of Traps in the Sicilian. Alright, let's get started. E4, C5, Sicilian. Knight F3, Knight C6, D4, C takes D4, Knight takes D4, G6, and we have some type of accelerated dragon where this bishop comes here and black tries to get this move in one push to D5 as opposed to stopping at D6 and then later on getting D5. So after G6, Knight C3, Bishop G7, Bishop E3, Knight F6. Again, notice this move has not been played yet. And one of the main lines, Bishop C4, basically putting a stop to that idea with this piece combined with the queen later after, say, the knight moves, or sometimes the knight even goes back here, or sometimes the knight will capture, putting maximum pressure on the D5 square to prevent this move. Alright, and after Bishop C4, Queen A5, and we have a pin here. Now what if White tries to go along with this normal plan as if he's playing the Yugoslav attack in the dragon variation? Queen D2 with the idea of castling queenside and playing F3 and G4 and so on and so forth. Well, here would be a bad move because this idea is one of the pluses of playing the accelerated dragon is that you don't get the aggressive attacks that you would get in the normal dragon. And actually, Queen A5 pretty much stops White from castling on the queen side. And this is one variation here. So if Bishop C4, Queen A5, and then Queen D2, Knight takes E4, wins. And if Knight takes E4, Queen D2 check. Not Bishop D2 because this knight will be unprotected. Even though it's unprotected, not adequately protected. King D2, and then Knight takes D4, and then black is just one material. Now some of you have a good tactical eye out there, and you're saying, hey, well, after Knight takes E4, why not Knight takes C6, attacking the queen? You know both queens are attacked. Well, black simply just plays Queen takes C3, and black is always going to be a pawn ahead in that variation. The basic thing to remember is that black is often going to have these kind of discoveries on this diagonal when the bishop is on G7. So again, it's a theme of attacking on the dark squares. That diagonal combined with this diagonal are very important for black in the Sicilian there. Alright, let's look at another one. Alright, E4. c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5, e6. This looks pretty normal, right? Far cry from our wing gambit that we just started out with in the first video. Now this is close to being the knight off, which would take place with a6. This is more of a Scheveningen variation, or Skyfenegen. I think that's the proper way to say it in German. So knight takes c6, b takes c6, g3, rook b8, bishop g2. Notice gives up the pawn. Rook takes b2, e5, attacking the knight, pawn. But the main idea is to play bishop takes c6 with check, and black is definitely better in this position, but for our purposes, excuse me, for our purposes, d takes e5 is played. Now again, let's combine the features to find the winning move here for white. Again, we have an unprotected piece here. We have a queen that is only protected by the king. We also have this pawn that is hanging. And we also realize that right now, white is just sacrificing material. So we have to make sure that we have adequate compensation. So combining these features to form a combination, we play queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, and now we have the king on the open file, which gives us another feature. How can we use this idea, combining it with the fact that this rook is unprotected? Some of you have spotted castle with check, and the rook is captured. Our next one, e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6, bishop e2, a6, castle, queen c7. Looks pretty typical. And what if white plays f4? Again, let's look at the features of the position. We had this after f4, right? What opportunities available? You see this dark square diagonal, right, leading to the king. So that's one thing we're looking for. Is there any opportunities on this dark square diagonal? The other feature, again, we're looking for combinations, so we want to combine ideas, is the knight on d4 is only protected by one piece, which makes it pretty vulnerable. So what can we do here? First, knight takes d4, which brings the queen to this square, and then we just bring the bishop here, and white is lost. You see how simple that was? Just combining the features in the position. At first it doesn't look like much, because if we brought the bishop here right away, then white would have time to defend and just play c3. And then say after queen b6, then simply king h1. So what that shows you is that when you have an opportunity to strike in chess, you have to be sure to spot it and then move as quickly as possible to exploit the vulnerability before your opponent can cover up his weakness. So here, it's a perfect opportunity to capture. He's only protected by one piece, so therefore that one piece, which is the queen, has to come out into the middle of the board, and then game over. Again, exploiting the dark squares in the Sicilian defense. Alright, another one. E4, C5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6, bishop e2, a6, castle, queen c7, and instead of f4 here, just to show you real quick, um, good for white, just to play with that idea. Now that we know that idea, not f4, it's just simply a good idea. A good move that can be played is either knight takes c6 and b takes c6, and follow that up by knight c3, and then we gotta have a different game going on. But this is not an opening survey, so let's move on. So e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6, knight c3, a6, bishop e3, queen c7. There it is, knight takes c6, queen takes c6, b takes c6 would have been better, but queen takes c6, bishop d4, just centralizing the bishop. Excuse me. Again, I want to press that theme about the dark squares. f6, bishop d3, and here's an interesting position. Here we have an unprotected piece, right? So black decides to play the move bishop c5. Now what would you play? And now it's white's turn, and now we look at the features and we see a couple of things here. One, we see again this bishop is what? Protected by only one piece. So we're definitely looking for opportunities to exploit that. And the second major feature I see is just like I always talk about the dark squares from the black perspective with the Sicilian. Well, if you're playing the white side, it's usually the opposite, and it's going to be the light squares that are vulnerable. And here we see with this pawn move f6, which was designed to let this bishop free, so this pawn wouldn't be vulnerable to capture from the d4 bishop. We see that after bishop c5, queen h5 check, and two pieces are too much, and the bishop is lost. So the basic idea in analogous positions with black or white is that anytime the f pawn moves and the king is not castled, You should always be looking for uh, those kind of tactics on the diagonals, whether it's the dark square diagonal or the light square diagonal. Dark square for black in black's case, or the light square diagonal leading to the king if you're playing the white pieces. Anytime that f pawn moves and the king is not castled. Okay, next, e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6. How about it? Knight c3, a6, bishop e3, queen c7, queen d2, b5. Just early aggression on the queen side. Notice black has not bothered to move these pieces yet. Instead, he fortifies this square and gets his counterplay going early. Again, the same idea. The Sicilians. b4, drive the knight away and attack the vulnerable e pawn. So after b5, castles right into it. Bishop b7. Again, same idea is to attack through the center. Knight b3. It's a good move. That's eyeing these squares, dark squares that have become weakened as a result of these pawn advances. Note that already white could put a piece on this square if he wishes. So let's see what happens if black continues his policy of just developing on the queen side. Rook c8, what would you do here? Now I want you to think in this position about the dark squares. I'm always talking about the dark squares. Why should we be thinking about the dark squares here? Because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of black's 7 remaining pawns are on light squares. And since all those pawns are on light squares, that means the dark squares have been left abandoned, basically. Because the pawns being on light squares, that means they only affect the light squares. Because remember, pawns cannot capture the square in front of them, right? They only can affect the squares on diagonals. So therefore, in this case, if you have all your pawns on light squares, that means they only can guard the light squares. And if they're only guarding light squares, then who's guarding the dark squares? In this case, only pieces can guard the dark squares. For instance, the queen here, the dark square bishop has to take these squares, and the knight on g8 has to guard these squares. No, that's a lot of arrows. Boy, that'll stick in your mind. You might have dreams about this, right? So if the pieces have to guard the dark squares, then that takes away from their attacking possibilities, because now they have to perform defensive duties. And that's one of the downsides of putting all your pawns on the same color. So with that major feature, right, remember we're looking for combinations. So what can we combine here? So first thing I see is the dark squares are weak. And then the second thing I see is the queen and rook are lined up together. So I'm wondering, how can I exploit that? I would love to put my bishop here and at least win a rook. That would be great. But it looks like he'll just take with the queen if I do that. Another feature I see also is again, the king side is weak in general with these pawn advance. So maybe I can sacrifice on b5. So in that case, if black had castled, that would be the better move. But black did not castle. Black played rook c8. So what's the difference here between rook c8 and castling? Now, although white is better here, he's not winning. But a simple move like bishop f4 is great, just exploiting the dark squares. And after d6, white has a better position. The d6, say for instance, king b1. And now you have a regular game where white holds a slight advantage. However, in this game, rook c8 is played. So you might say, hey, there's no big difference. He just doesn't want to castle into a weakened king side, queen side, and he wants to wait and castle on the king side. Besides, his king is safe. The problem is after bishop b6, bishop cannot be taken now because it would be mate. And that's the difference. With castling, this square is protected. Here it's not. So now, after bishop b6, the queen can't go anywhere. If the queen goes back, mate. Right? The queen goes back there, the bishop would just capture. So this shot out of the blue. In this instance, again, we're exploiting the weakness on the dark squares, right? And what we're doing is we recognize that this pawn is protected by the queen, and the king for that matter, and we simply perform a tactic called removing the defender, and now this pawn becomes vulnerable. See, we remove the protector, and that pawn becomes vulnerable. And that, my friends, is the end of that game. Alright, and one more quick one, and that'll be it for now. I'll leave you with this one. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop c4. Here's a little bunny for you. Alright, bishop g4. Remember what I always tell you about the bishop coming here? It's always a nice policy to play a move like e6, just blunting the action of this bishop on that diagonal. And here's a perfect example of why. Again, unprotected piece, vulnerability on light squares, lead in development, leads to bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and knight g5, followed by the subsequent capture of the queen. So watch those. The lesson with that right there is watch those early pins. Some people like to bring that bishop out real early instead of developing the knights. Just bring the bishop out real early and initiate a pin. Got to be careful with that. Just pinning just to be pinning is not always winning. So again, bishop takes, check, king takes, knight g5, and it's all over. King e8 and queen takes g4. Again, look at the weakness of the white squares. Again, if you're playing white pieces, the Sicilian, always keep an eye out on those light squares. And if you're playing black, look at the dark squares. Alright guys, that's it for now. And I'll catch you on the other one. Another video. Please subscribe and like and comments are welcome. Talk to you later.